And today I am thrilled to have Andy Wilson here. He is the original connector, collaborator, creating many incredible things. He has degrees from Harvard and Dartmouth College. He has personally been my city councilman, my vice mayor, Friday Coffee Meetup, Innovate Pasadena, now the Alliance for SoCal Innovation. And he does have a few bullet points, but when I was thinking about Andy, for me personally, he's like the catalyst of a stone being thrown in water and the ripples that it makes. And the thing that's amazing about Andy is that it's not just him that grows through those circles. It's everybody who's met him. Everybody else grows as well. So I am incredibly grateful to him. I'm losing my words. I'm incredibly grateful to him because he just brings us along in the circles with him. And as he grows, we get to grow. So today you're going to get to grow because you're going to get to hear from him. And we're so grateful to welcome him to the Friday Coffee Meetup date.
Thank you, Christy. It's very kind. It's been great collaborating with her and many others in this room. I have a short presentation. I remember when Christy was asking me to do this, I got to make sure, is my audio on? Do we know?
Yeah, your audio, yeah.
Okay, perfect. When Christy asked me to do this, it was 4 or 5 months ago. Then, I don't know about you, suddenly I woke up 2 days ago and said, oh my God, that's this week. So we had a board meeting yesterday. And then but I did want to put a few thoughts together to share with you from my 10 years of building innovation communities. Let me see if this is going to work. No, that didn't work. Let's try it this way. So a little bit about me, some definitions. We use innovation, entrepreneurship, creativity interchangeably. So I thought it would be worthwhile. And it was helpful for me to think about those words and how they relate to what we're talking about. Some models, some best practice models around building innovation communities. I've been studying this for 10 years, so I thought I would kind of pull out a few items around that. A case study of what we're doing at the Alliance. So talk a little bit about, obviously, Innovate Pasadena, but most of my work for the last 6 years has been more regionally. So I wanted to share some of that with you as well. And then some recent local successes on building the innovation community here in Pasadena. Some great stuff happening as well. So I'm excited about Pasadena, my community, and then some parting thoughts. And then if people still read, I have a reading list of some of my favorite books around building innovation communities. So you can learn about that. Whoops, I went a little too fast there. So, I'm not going to go through this. I think what I would say is that my career started off in corporate America. And I ended up, believe it or not, working in a printing company. You remember printing that stuff on the ink on paper? And that was in the late 90s. And you can imagine when digital technology showed up in the printing business, how disruptive that was. And at the time, I know it's hard to believe, I was the young guy in a very well-established business. So ended up being the technologist for a large printing company. So suddenly I got into technology. And then it was corporate America, so corporate American technology. And I love technology more than corporate America. So if you want to be a corporate refugee, you can join me. So I've been in the kind of the startup world for the last 20 plus years. Ran a number of startups, ran a venture fund. So what I always think about, like, individual entrepreneurship is great. And if you're running a venture fund, you're running a portfolio. So you actually have a bunch of children. Not all of them are summa cum laude, like this gentleman's grandson who's graduating. So running a venture fund was great fun in the sense that you work with a lot of startups. But I kept asking myself, if you care about entrepreneurship, what is the most impactful way to serve the community? And I think building ecosystems, which is the kind of environment that we build startups, is kind of the most universal way to help the broadest number of people. So my attention has turned to building innovation ecosystems. So a little bit on terminology. This is actually from Stanford, from the design school. And so I just want to make sure this is a good model for us to think about. And they're all related. Like, you can't do something unless you have an imagination. So I use a little example. So think about cars. And I know we're in Los Angeles. Probably some of you drove here. So if you like sketching cars and thinking about cars, you're using your imagination. We think about directed imagination as like creativity against a problem. So maybe in this case, Is there a car that can avoid traffic jams? And did anyone get stuck in traffic today? Maybe you all walked. I walked, so there's no traffic jam. Then innovation is applying a unique solution towards a problem. So in this case, what about a flying car? And then I think about entrepreneurship is taking that concept and building a product. Okay, so you can't do something new unless you have imagination, unless you're applying imagination to a problem. That's creativity. And what we care about ultimately is creating products that we can bring to the world. Okay, and I when I was looking at this, there's actually someone's building a flying car. They're taking pre-orders. Some of the founders who invested in Tesla are backing this company. They are $300,000. So your time will have to be very valuable to buy a flying car. But once again, someone had an idea, like cars, they thought about traffic, and they translated that into a product. I also wanted to show kind of where my interest area is. So once again, innovation is about new ideas, and entrepreneurship is about building companies. We have Dan, who started a coffee shop. It's a great coffee shop. I love his coffee, but there are a lot of coffee shops. So he's an entrepreneur, but probably not necessarily new to the world thinking. Though I love what he does with employing youth. So that's a different story. That's probably new. So there is innovation there as well. But I love this world of being innovation-driven entrepreneurship. Like, where are new businesses and what are the new creative ideas behind those businesses? Here's another model. We talk about, once again, startup communities. This is from Brad Feld and Ian Hathaway. So you'll hear me reference those two folks frequently. Brad Feld is a little bit of a mentor of mine. Christy, maybe a mentor of yours, or Brad's a mentor of mine. Brad is a founder of the Foundry Group, which is a very large venture capital fund in Boulder, Colorado. But he's also a prolific writer around startups and startup communities. And I don't know if people remember when we first started Innovate Pasadena 11 years ago, Brad published his first book called Startup Communities. And I remember two things. Someone was asking about this earlier. One is we had started the coffee meetup actually in April of 2022. I'm sorry, 2012. Sorry, 2012. So 11 years ago, April. Innovate Pasadena wasn't founded until the fall of 2012. And I decided that we should get entrepreneurs and innovation people together for coffee. And we started in Jones's Coffee. People know Jones's on Raymond. And then we moved to the Ness's at El Portal. And then we moved to Copa Vita's back room. And then moved to the convention center, and then we've been here across campus. So this kind of idea of getting innovators together informally over coffee was something that I like coffee, so I thought it was a good thing to do. Brad publishes his book in October of 2012, so 4 months later. And he's talking about the Boulder experiment. Boulder was kind of a nice college town with not a lot of innovation going on, but now it's one of those great communities where a tremendous amount of innovation happens. And in his book, he talks about a coffee meetup, which I thought was kind of funny because we had already started doing a coffee meetup. And Brad's first stop on his book tour for his Startup Communities book was at Caltech, because we had him come here. So we're the first stop. And now he's published 4 other books on building startup communities. So Brad has been a great collaborator. As he lives in Boulder, has a second home in Rancho Santa Fe, just outside of San Diego. So when he's in town, he and I often get together and compare notes about building startup communities. So they are a bunch of kind of, I'd say, thought leaders who think about how we build ecosystems that allow entrepreneurs to thrive. I did like this model because when I think about why it matters, startups are at the bottom, right? We need startups. And if you have a bunch of startups, they're part of a startup community. But then we think about the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and I think about Innovate Pasadena really connecting the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Not everyone in this room is an entrepreneur, but you're part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And you think about that more broadly as a broader innovation ecosystem. So you could be doing corporate innovation. You could be working on tech transfer, right? So that's the broader innovation ecosystem. And I believe fundamentally, innovation is a key driver for economic vitality. So that's the economy. Then ultimately, if the economy is doing well, hopefully our society is doing well. So this is a nice model about how all these pieces hold together, right? And hopefully you can see how you fit in that model yourself. So I wanted to, as I mentioned, I'm going to just talk about these 4 points. These are from Brad's book, but I think we try to practice these every day. So, and I once again, in your reading list, I will reference some of his books. There's a new book called the Startup Community Field Guide that just came out about 3 months ago, and I wrote a book review on that with the help of ChatGPT, which is actually somewhat true. So a few things just to take away for those of you who are thinking about maybe building a startup community in your own hometown or want to be part of it. Entrepreneurs are kind of the core of a startup community. Very often we see economic development organizations from cities saying, hey, we want to champion startups. I hate to say it, having been an elected official myself, government officials are not really the best to relate to startups. Having spent 8 years in government and started now 9 companies, there's a maybe opposite end of the spectrum. I know that's hard to believe. Government is not particularly creative and entrepreneurial. And so it's hard for like a government to actually think about even what entrepreneurs need. So the entrepreneurs need to actually help people like government, academia, policymakers think about what it means for them to be successful, right? What is the infrastructure we need? What is the building codes we need? What is the regulatory environment? You can't have policymakers doing that in a vacuum. They're very academic. So our voices need to be heard. So point one about kind of Brad's thinking is we need to hear the voices of people who are building businesses. You know, we're on the front line. Point two is like the time frame, right? It's like building ecosystems is not something you just add water and shake. I've been at it for more than a decade. It is something you have to believe like deeply in your heart that this is something that's important. And it's like building a startup company, right? It doesn't happen overnight. I can tell you, having started many, it's a 3, 5, 10-year time horizon. And I think building startup communities is the same. That's one reason, by the way, I'm also cautious of having electeds involved because they get elected every 4 years. And they're like, oh, we haven't built a startup community in 4 years. It didn't work. Well, you know, it is much more kind of building the psyche and putting the building blocks together. It's not an instant kind of gratification thing. So once again, having patience, inclusivity, it does require kind of many stakeholders. And I'll talk about some of my lessons about bringing on stakeholders. It's not meant to be kind of an ivory tower elite thing. Everyone should have access both to be benefit from the startup community, but also contribute. Look at Christy was talking about all the volunteers who were today to make Coffee Meetup happen. That's you couldn't do without a community behind you. So I think having a very inclusive community is vital to having a successful startup ecosystem. And then activities. This is a great activity. And go back to I think this ecosystem word. It's a system. It's how the pieces work together. And the only way we see how the system works together is when we have an opportunity to interact. Like I love having people on Zoom, but it's very hard to interact. And maybe I'm old school, but the idea of being here together and connecting and thinking about how we make connections and relationships, how we help people build businesses, find co-founders, find jobs like that. That's really a lot more, I think, frictionless in real life. And good programming actually creates those opportunities for people to create that connectivity. So programming is kind of the engine of building that connectivity, which is essential to an ecosystem. So once again, I'll share Brad's book, but I think these are good guiding principles, and I've used them in my work as well. Why does it matter? This is Moretti's book around the new geography of jobs. I don't know about you, but California is an expensive place to live. And if we can create high quality jobs, innovation jobs, then we can afford to live, or more of us can afford to live in wonderful places like Southern California. Interesting work. So he's a economist out of Berkeley, and they looked at when you kind of create a new job, what are the secondary effects in your economy? And when you create a high quality startup job, it creates 5 other jobs in the economy because first of all, the incomes tend to be higher. They hire, with that tech person, they probably hire customer support people. They spend money in the economy. So these are jobs. This is why people are very eager to have tech jobs in their economy because it has this multiplier effect. So one good high tech job creates 5 jobs in your community. Since we have Caltech here in Pasadena, I actually found this stat pretty interesting. For each new university patent, researchers create 15 additional jobs are created. So if you're in the world of taking research And I think we had somebody who has a startup that's maybe in the kind of biotech space, and you're creating intellectual property. Every time you get a patent, they've shown that that creates 15 jobs in your ecosystem. So be nice to your friends at Caltech, especially if they're getting patents, they're creating jobs in your community. I like this model as well. And what's cool about this is I've seen models that have entrepreneurs at the center. I think purpose is really important. And, I try to live a purpose-driven life. I also tell entrepreneurs who are building companies, the company should reflect your purpose. And why do I say that? So when you have entrepreneurs who build companies, raise your hand if you're an entrepreneur. Okay, great. Now, it's not easy, is it? And if you're kind of like, oh, this is a great idea because it looks great on paper, it's hard to keep going. But if it's part of your purpose, that becomes kind of the psychic energy to keep going when things get hard. So I think kind of purpose is kind of that North Star that guides us in our work and keeps us motivated through the ups and downs. And I think that's true also in startup communities and innovation ecosystems. I like this quote, vibrant, well-known innovation ecosystems tend to have purposes that reflect the vision, values, and motivations of the actors driving the ecosystem. So not every ecosystem is the same. Like you think about what makes the Pasadena innovation ecosystem special. What could that be? Like I mentioned Caltech and JPL, so there's kind of a science element to it. We're not Silicon Beach people. I mean, that's a whole different ecosystem. And I know that well, and I can talk a little bit about what's going on in Southern California, but kind of building authentic ecosystems that reflect what's unique about your geography and your community is absolutely mission critical. I hate when people say we're trying to build the next Silicon Valley. Build the best version of yourself and your own community, because Silicon Valley has specific traits, characteristics that make it Silicon Valley. So you should build your own flavor of innovation economy, not trying to build some kind of phony copy of something else, right? So be authentic. It's a lot easier, honestly, too, when you kind of are reflective about what is unique and special about where you are. So I like this idea of purpose and kind of being authentic. I think, frankly, it's a good rule for everything we do. It makes life a lot easier, but does apply a lot to innovation communities. So those are some models. I thought I would talk a little bit about the work we're doing at the Alliance. I should say that Innovate Pasadena was kind of a bit of a prototype. So Innovate Pasadena was building innovation community and strengthening Pasadena as a center of innovation and technology. When we started that 10 years ago, really it was just a bunch of folks who were like, hey, we're trying to go into Silicon Beach. We think great stuff is happening here in this part of Los Angeles. But if we don't have the connectivity and community, it's really hard to feel, it makes the job harder. Like you're kind of on your own. It's very lonely and difficult. So we decided that it made sense to create a vibrant, credible innovation community in the east side of Los Angeles. So Innovate Pasadena was focused on doing that. A few kind of bullet points around that. When we started that work, there was only there's Pasadena Angels here and maybe one venture fund, and now there's over a dozen venture firms that call Pasadena home. And also, so I kind of said that's one metric of success is capital in your community. I think also when people think about Southern California and where innovation happens, Pasadena is very frequently called out as a place a certain type of innovation happens. So we may not be the center of consumer media and content, but you think of things like robotics, SaaS, biochemistry, like that's Pasadena. You think of places like Orange County MedTech Center, right? So kind of each of these centers, and I'll talk a little bit about that, have their own unique characteristic, and goes back to that kind of being authentic. So we have to be authentic. We're really good at some areas, and it kind of creates a cluster around that. So I'm very proud of the progress that we've made in Pasadena. And it's a little bit like a flywheel. Like once you start building the narrative and companies start coming here, I mean, literally there's 15 robotic companies in Pasadena, like amazing companies. You can imagine why, because JPL is one of the most important robotics and autonomy companies probably in the world. And so we have a cluster here, and there's great kind of cross-pollination of that area. So having that vibrancy, I think, is great for our economy, but also people who are running those institutions and those businesses get to kind of cross-pollinate each other. So let me spend a few minutes on Innovate Pasadena. The Alliance. So this is the Alliance. This is our mission statement. So capitalizing the compelling diversity of talent, ideas, and perspectives. So hopefully you'll appreciate that Southern California is one of the most diverse places in the United States. And it's good and bad in the sense that if everything's very homogeneous, it's very easy to line them up and tell your story. I think it's pretty boring, honestly, if you're super homogeneous. We love the diversity, but it's a little bit harder to put your hands around it. So we're kind of celebrating that diversity as part of our competitive advantage. So remember, I talk about being authentic. Like, we are an incredibly diverse place. You think about the nationalities, the number of schools, the number of industries in here. It's not just one place. So we think that diversity is actually creates creative thinking. Like, like in Silicon Valley, they talk about the problem they have with kind of homogeneity, like, kind of this kind of echo chamber. Like, we're not going to get that here. If we all wanted to be homogeneous in Southern California, we would fail. It's not possible. So we're just embracing that and making our own. So leveraging on that is a competitive advantage, then helping people who want to bring breakthroughs to the world. That's what we want to do. So that's our mission at the Alliance. As I mentioned, I know this is a map of Southern California. So unlike Silicon Valley that has maybe, San Francisco, Palo Alto, and San Jose, so it's 3 places, we have about 15 innovation communities in Southern California. Very spread out. I call them villages, like Pasadena is kind of listed somewhere here. Burbank, Pasadena, right here, right? High-tech engineering, robotics, data analytics. Each of these communities have expertise, their own authentic place, but none of them are big enough to be powerhouses in their own. So our work at the Alliance is to be a super connector. So think about NATO or the UN, like bringing collective impact together, because no one of these little communities is going to be a powerhouse on its own. So we are really focused on unifying Southern California as an energized network, so we can be a global player. And I'm happy to say, and we'll talk a little bit about outcomes, but if you look at innovation impact reports, there's something called Startup Genome. We're number 4 in the world in Southern California in Startup Genome. So we do punch as a collective quite well, but it is because we're adding up the sum of the parts to really force multiply them. So some of our goals, like improving access to venture capital at the Alliance. So if you're starting a company, access to capital is critical. I remember, make sure I'm keeping track of my time too. Okay. I remember when I started my venture fund about 15 years ago, there were probably a dozen other funds, maybe 2 dozen at the most in Southern California. Now there's 150 funds in Southern California, but it's still hard to get access. It's kind of a little bit of a club. So we're trying to figure out how to get diverse entrepreneurs opportunities to access capital. Priority for us, champion our diversity and our capabilities, tell our story, like that, whether that's for Southern California or your own community, tell your story, strengthen the sub-communities, foster collaboration across stakeholder groups. So you think about who's involved in the innovation economy, entrepreneurs, of course, venture capitalists, corporate players, academia, other community-based organizations and governments. Like, there's all these moving pieces to bring them together and engage corporations to kind of invest in their region. This is our programming model. As I mentioned, these are the groups that we connect with. Last year, we just did our annual report. So this is fresh off the press. We engaged just over 1,100 innovation leaders across Southern California in our work. And we do that through kind of 10 sets of programs that actually target those stakeholders. And I tell people, like, why do we do all this programming? Go back to Brad Feld's point. We bring programming to drive connectivity and build community. Like, programming is not just an activity you go through. The goal is, are we creating connections and relationships? Because I've always said innovation and startup is very much a team sport. Like, you're never going to create a great innovation community or a great startup on your own. So, but you have to figure out where the players are. And if you're not part of an ecosystem where you can identify interested players who want to collaborate with you, it's really hard to build a team, right? So this programming allows you to figure out who's out there so you can build your team. We measure connections made at the Alliance. We actually did over 2,200 connections. This is a great quote from the head of Mitsubishi Innovation Group. They moved from Silicon Valley to Orange County, and they're building technology for managing drone fleets. Okay, so they're kind of the operator. It says, our relationship with the Alliance was a key factor that attracted us to the region, as it's been instrumental in helping Mitsubishi Electric Innovation Group, identify and connect with key players who would benefit from collaborating with us. When you have an innovation community, you actually create impact for entrepreneurs and innovators. So a lot of things that we do, once again, 1,100 leaders. This is just to show you that we're busy. We did 62 events last year. So those are kind of catalysts for uniting a very disparate region. So I wanted to wrap up with some local success stories in Pasadena. This is my home. I love it here. I was had my parents over for dinner a couple nights ago. They're old, and 86 and 87, and I dragged them here. They lived in like 16 other places, and they've been here now like 5 years full time. And they were just saying how extraordinarily lucky they feel to live in such a place like Pasadena. We have great institutions here, not just JPL and Caltech, but if you think about the Norton Synan, the Huntington Art Center, and if you don't like driving, you literally I walk to those places, right? So you think about a concentrated community that is rich in resources, that has great architecture. I'm an architecture junkie. This is pretty extraordinary. But we want jobs. We want great jobs, the next generation. For your grandson, when he graduates summa cum laude from, I'm afraid to say school, because if I say USC, I'm going to get booed. If I say, UCLA, I'll get booed by some. But we want jobs for our next generation here, relevant jobs, high quality jobs. Some recent success stories: Zencor, Caltech spin out, moved to Monrovia, just opened a $40 million, 100,000 square foot. Their cancer treatment and kind of I'm not a biologist, but they do cancer treatment in their biotech company. They just came back to Pasadena, 300 jobs. General Motors Design Center, moving from Hollywood to Pasadena, 120,000 square feet, designing next generation vehicles for General Motors. Lilly acquired Protober Technology for $1 billion, Caltech intellectual property, 15-person company. I should have joined that company. $1 billion exit. And now Lilly wants to build more of their R&D in Pasadena. Great win for us. Carnegie. So you may be familiar with Carnegie Observatories. They're part of Carnegie Sciences. Carnegie Sciences is bringing their life science and biology groups from Stanford and from Johns Hopkins to Pasadena. They're taking 150,000 square feet just north of Caltech. So once again, innovation, science, kind of a lot of researchers there as well. And then I just heard that BYD Motors, anyone know who BYD Motors is? Build Your Dreams. They're the largest electric car company in the world, the largest battery manufacturer. They moved their North American headquarters from downtown Los Angeles to Pasadena just actually a month ago. So things are happening. And I like to think that, you can't say Innovate Pasadena made these things happen, but I can tell you that they want to be in communities where they're innovators and vibrancy, and the fact that we have created a community of innovation champions and that they're welcomed to that community did come up in the calculus of where they're trying to make these investments. So this does work. It doesn't happen overnight. Parting thoughts. So as I said, this is a team sport. Whether you're building a startup, innovation community, you need to be a leader and organizer, but the lone wolf is not going to work. You're never getting any impact. You're never going to succeed. You're never going to scale. So think about who you're enlisting in your own venture to get success, right? You need to champion and you need to articulate and enlist others. Be authentic. Talked about that before. Humble. If you're authentic, humble, and appreciative, then you actually build trust and people will want to become part of your work. Once again, whether that's a startup or building an innovation community. Find motivation from the heart. As I said, find something that you're passionate about. That keeps you going, but operate from the mind, like be realistic about what you're trying to do, who the competitors are, but get motivated internally. That will allow you to kind of persist in the journey. Enjoy the journey. Say, having been on many journeys. Doesn't always turn out quite the way you want, but if you're enjoying the journey, it's still a lot of fun. And then actively listen to others. I say about how. I think one of the lessons I learned early on when starting companies is that you want to have advisors and people who give you input, and you should listen to that input, but you need to synthesize that and still build what you're trying to build. You can't let people kind of take ownership of what your vision is, because then it's no longer your path and you kind of get lost. So balance the feedback that you get from others in terms of figuring out where you're going, but make sure you're authentic to what your mission is, right? Don't give up your mission, because then you lose your orientation. So it's a kind of a balancing act. And if you do what you love, it won't be work, right? So I've decided, for the last 20 years of my life is to do what I love. And that's helping, being an entrepreneur and helping other entrepreneurs and helping people who want to change the world, make it a better place, who aren't afraid to take risks, who are playing the long game, and I think who are part of a community, right? So if you do those are things that are important to me. My wife's a lawyer. She's like, how come you love your job so much? Because I love doing those things. Lawyering, maybe it's not as fun, but hey, pays the bills. So anyway, my reading list, so if you care about any of this stuff, I know what, we can make it available somehow, perhaps. These are some great books. I mentioned here all Brad Feld's books. This is the latest one, Build the Fort, which is the Startup Community Builders Field Guide. If you're really interested in this stuff, it's actually great. Lots of research done in this area. Lots of interest in building startup communities. Governments love it, but it's as much art as it is science, right? It's like building a startup. So anyway, great to see you all again. Great to be back in a Friday morning coffee meetup. I think maybe we have time for a few questions.
We do.
Okay.
First,
Thank you.
let's take. Do you want to leave that up? Actually, I was going to have him take a picture.
Oh.
It's okay. No, we're good. We'll find a way to get it to you. Evan is going to come around. We don't have the microphone today. We're going to ask you to enunciate. We also ask that you keep your stories and comments for Andy after, and we're just focusing on Q&A. So a short sentence with a question mark at the end is what we're looking at. And Evan's going to select some people. So enunciate well, and we'll have a few Q&A.
And stand up. I'm going to ask you to
Yeah.
stand when you ask the question. The first hand was candidates, but I will ask you. So, and it's perspective from a city council person and an innovator space. So, we've seen how distance learning has affected our students and the learning has dropped off. So, in terms of the entrepreneurial space, ecosystem is not going to be as robust in 15 years. What does a healthy relationship between startup world and education space look like? Middle and high school level that way.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert in ed tech. Certainly, the pandemic was very disruptive to learning for many kids, and I know we're dealing with that school system. I would point out, an anecdotal example is my younger son had the best time ever during the pandemic. He was a huge champion of Khan Academy and started coding when he was 11. And I think part of this, my point is that you got to disrupt the learning models. Like, I think these tools, if not properly understood and aren't going to create the benefits. So I do think there's real opportunity to democratize education through technology. I was spending some time with Michael Crow. Does anyone know who Michael Crow is? He's the president of ASU, which is the largest institution of higher ed in the country, 160,000 students. And they're democratizing education. And ed tech and technology plays a very important role, but they also get people together in cohorts in micro communities. So I don't think we can kind of abdicate and say, hey, chat GPT is going to teach my kid. I think we need to implement those tools, but we also need to think about the human part of education and be creative in how we bring this thing together. Challenge, of course, in education, a bit like healthcare. It's not the most receptive to change. And I think, I pull my hair out a little bit in the sense that those are industries that are most, have the upside and the potential of changing the most and having the most positive impact, but they're the least receptive to change. Right? Academic institutions, trust me, I deal with a lot of universities. Michael Crow is an exception. Also, healthcare systems could greatly benefit from things like telemedicine, but the payer system doesn't work that way. So innovation, the technology is important, but how it gets subsumed into the industry is as important, and those are going to be some real challenges. So I'm kind of, I'm hopeful, because that's the way I wake up every day. It's a good way to wake up. But there's work to be done into making sure that this technology, just like AI or chat GPT, Is it constructive technology versus destructive?
I quick question, how many examples of smaller successes very large?
Well, I look at, because of the growing presence of venture capital, let's say in Pasadena, I know the number of venture-backed companies in Pasadena, and those are transaction, individual deals, has gone up tremendously, especially in early stage, where you're betting much more, as they say, on the jockey versus the outcome. Like as a late stage company, it's like buying equities on a NASDAQ. But when you're starting an early stage company, they're betting on the founders, the co-founders, and that means they actually want to know who those people are. I know we have Pat and Pat's angels, having the angel groups, having the investors in your community, especially at the early stage, creates more access to entrepreneurs and investors. And that has helped that I can show stats and show that Pasadena's share of dollars being invested has gone up because of the presence of investors.
When you look at that funding landscape, you see that there are gaps. For example, Pasadena has gotten a lot better at early stage, angel VC seed. Is there a gap in Series A or B or C or what have you? And then also in Southern California.
Yeah. So, we are in a little bit of, I'm gonna call it a nuclear winter, but a downturn in the tech world. I can tell you because those are all our partners. And the amount of VC that's being invested today is about half of what it was being invested 2 years ago. That being said, in Southern California, when we started the alliance 6 years ago, about $9 billion went into Southern California as a whole. Last year it was 22 billion, down from 30 billion the year before. There's been a massive increase in the amount of capital coming to Southern California. Most of the growth in terms of local capital has been in the early stage, which is really where we need it, as I mentioned, because that's where the connections are made. The big checks are still coming often from Silicon Valley, sovereign wealth funds, which is okay, because then you actually have the metrics to show, and those dollars can travel much more easily than the early stage dollars that tend to be more localized. So we do import, even last year, about 2/3 or 70% of the dollars that went into Southern California companies came from check writers who were outside of our geography. But when you look at the early stage, it's about 75% of the deals, early stage and seed deals, are done with local dollars, which is, that makes sense. This is the local community, and that used to not be the case. So I think we've kind of helped where the challenge, the bottleneck has been, was earlier, and that's more important. Now it's moved a little bit later stage. So I saw March Capital raised $700 million fund. B Capital just raised $1 billion fund. So we're finally seeing some mega funds in Southern California, which is nice. But that dollar, they don't, when you're that big, they don't consider themselves Southern California investors anymore. They're global investors. So there's been good progress in the venture community, notwithstanding what's happened in the last 18 months. Obviously, with the markets kind of slowing down, the equity markets, then venture funds are not getting exits. So they're not raising new funds. So they're slowed down how much they're deploying of their capital into new deals. So there has been a market slowdown across, the whole category. That was a long answer.
So that was great. Thank you. Next question. Thank you for stand up. Yeah. My question is, have you developed a framework for the application across local governments to incentivize people in places?
Yeah. The answer to that is no. I wish there was one. And part of this is kind of the life trajectory of kind of both Innovate Pasadena and the Alliance. I feel like the advocacy at the policy level only could be effective when you have a community voice behind it. So most of our work has been organizing communities. And I just can tell you that the Alliance, we're now far enough along in terms of we're able to represent the needs of the community on what we would advocate for at a policy level, right? So, and you can imagine, in Southern California, it is difficult to operate a scale business. There's a lot of good laws, but compared to places people could be building businesses. Texas, Florida, like the employment laws are very complicated. The regulatory regimen is very difficult. So those do kind of create roadblocks to people who want to scale their businesses. And so how do you represent those interests? But also knowing, frankly, having been the regulatory side as an elected, much of that regulation is well-intentioned. Right? The problem is when you add it all up, it becomes very difficult as an employer to be successful. So there's a competing tension there. Obviously, businesses don't vote, employees and they vote. So I think historically policymakers have been tilted towards representing the interest of workers because they're the ones who put the ballot in the ballot box. But also we have to think about, they also want to have jobs. So if we kind of make it so difficult to scale businesses in California, then we're going to have a job problem. We certainly will have, fast food jobs because we need to eat, but high-tech jobs, they're more portable, especially in the world of remote work. So those are things those are policy questions that we're starting to think about. And, those are more kind of state issues than they are local issues. Local issues, and just to give you an example, when I was on the state council in Pasadena, there were some onerous requirements for on new wet labs for biotech that were non-market. Anyone else? So I went through and with the people who wanted to build wet lab space, which is what we should be doing here in Pasadena. They said it's too expensive to meet these requirements. They're non-market. So we got the Building and Planning Commission codes to be more market, and so that some projects now could go through and became competitive. So there's kind of more at a micro level, we can do that. We should be doing that. But the employment environment is one that I think about. It's harder because we're like working so hard to create successful companies. And they're like, oh yeah, we're going to move all our growth is going to be somewhere else. I'm like, what? We helped raise you here. So there's some frustration when that happens, as you can imagine. Because we are trying to move the needle and then they leave. So we're done. Yes. Mike. Well, I think being part of it is the most important thing. Like people want innovation. And if you're just heads down in your lab and you're a startup and you're complaining like, why isn't the community more vibrant? I think have agency and go out and be proactive in being change agents yourselves. I think, we are entrepreneurial, right? So be entrepreneurial and kind of take some agency and go out and think about what you would like to energize your community. And it could be as simple as coming to events like this and connecting and feeling like you're part of something, right? Or going out and helping someone you meet here who's trying to build a business here that you can help. So helping each other is a way to feed our community. So I think there's kind of one-to-one, and then there's kind of the organization of how we are a startup community. We have Innovate Pasadena, it's still around. I know, they're still championing. I know they're trying to reinvigorate their work as like many other community-based organizations were impacted by COVID. So it's an opportunity to rethink. And I think the good news is in Pasadena, we've made a lot of headway in the last decade. So what is their next agenda and how do they help build the innovation community locally? We all should be able to have input in what that is and have a role in making that come to life. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andy.
Can I put this out so you got the picture?